Welcome to the Well-Oiled Mind. We specialize in history, biography, psychology, and philosophy set within a European context. Join us now and illuminate your life. Today's video is part 4 of our 5-part Bringers of Destiny series, where we are rating 5 of Rome's best generals. Today, we'll be discussing Gaius Marius. To rate each of our generals, we came up with a very regimented analytical process. It's discussed in detail in the first 3 videos, so for the sake of time, we're not going to tread that ground again. So if you're just checking in, we recommend you go back, watch the series in order, and that'll give you the best context and explanation of our method. Check out the description below for links to those earlier videos. Before we begin, we'd like to recognize subscriber Doke Felix, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. We asked for feedback, and Felix delivered some really rich comments. I hope that everybody out there will feel free to do exactly the same thing. One thing Felix recommended was researching the pronunciation of ancient place and tribal names, so we worked on that this week using various academic sites and Latin pronunciation engines, as most of the names are in that language. Thanks again, Felix. I'll ask for your patience in this, and let's consider this a process, not a singular event. I'm not a professional linguist, and some of these are probably still going to be a little bit off, but we'll give it a best shot. Now, let's get to our general. Gaius Marius lived from 157 BC to 86 BC. Of all the generals we've discussed, it is Marius who has the most diversified portfolio, so to speak. He fought bandits in Hispania, participated in the Jugurthine War in Numidia, battled against Germanic tribes like the Cimbri and Teutons in Gaul, slaughtered his fellow Romans in the Social War, and then again in the Bellum Octavianum, and even did battle with the Gauls. And while not directly the subject of our video today, he was Consul of Rome an impressive 7 times. We bring this up because it allowed him an unprecedented level of influence, not just on political, but also military affairs. Marius' military career started in earnest in 114 BC when he was sent to Hispania, modern-day Spain, as the governor. He had served as a subordinate to other military leaders since 134 BC, yet in Hispania he was able to conduct unimpeded, independent command. His exploits during this time seemed to be low-scale. They consisted merely of clearing away brigands from mining regions. However, these sorts of operations probably did let him start forming his personal command style and a unique military theory of victory. In 109 BC, Marius joined the field forces of the consul at the time, Quintus Caecilius Metellus, in his war against a highly disruptive Numidian king, Jugurtha. Jugurtha had killed off his brothers and essentially upset the balance of power in North Africa. This was new because Numidia, under Jugurtha's brother, had been a reliable Roman ally. His violent takeover ended the surety on the southern edge of Rome's Great Lake. This conflict would be known as the Jugurthine War. Though it's not clear, it seems likely that Marius served as Metellus' second-in-command, a clear nod to Marius' capabilities as a leader and strategist. Marius performed well here and distinguished himself in a great desert battle at the Mudel River. Having been scattered about into fragmented groups by whirling Numidian cavalry attacks, Metellus' army was highly vulnerable and at risk of being defeated in detail. Somehow, Marius managed to assemble some of these disorganized groups, fight his way through the Numidians with about half a legion, and join up his stragglers with those of Metellus. Then, the recombined force actually rejoined the battle and subsequently scattered the Numidians. When the dust eventually settled, however, the battle produced no significant results for either side. For the purposes of our study, though, Marius demonstrated he was a highly skilled tactician and a brave leader who would not wilt under pressure. Marius was elected consul in 107 BC, partly by promising that he, unlike Metellus, could end the Numidian War quickly. This was easier said than done, and he essentially experienced the same struggles as Metellus. Marius could not bring Jugurtha to battle, so he went on a campaign of devastation, burning villages, killing supporters of Jugurtha, and doing whatever he could to weaken the Numidian king. Marius pursued Jugurtha south and then west. As they neared the Mauritanian lands, Jugurtha's father-in-law, King Bocchus, joined the war against the Romans. The combined royal forces surprised the Romans and issued them a frightful beating. All the Romans could initially do was form the orbis, or circular defensive formation, normally a harbinger of imminent disaster. However, Marius and his subordinate Sulla held out and regrouped at nightfall. Next, Marius did the unthinkable. Early the next morning, he rallied his men and marched them in the pre-dawn light against the joint enemy encampment. Amazingly, the Romans put the North Africans onto the back foot and drove them away. Over time, Marius concocted a plan to pull apart the Bocchus-Jugurtha alliance. Having recruited Bocchus to his cause, Bocchus then actually conspired to capture Jugurtha and eventually handed him over to Sulla. What Marius was not able to do through direct action, he did by guile, and this is an absolutely essential skill for a commander, even today. We can again look at a contemporary example to underpin this precept. The U.S. Army has an entire field manual dedicated to this, titled Field Manual 3-13.4, Army Support to Military Deception, which is fairly current, being dated from 2019. In the wake of a crisis resulting from Roman armies being totally destroyed by Germanic tribes, Marius was elected consul in absentia in 104 BC. The ravaging Germanic tribe, the Cimbri, after annihilating a Roman army at Arezzo, the modern-day city of Orange in France, penetrated west into Hispania and devastated that region. Marius relocated to Aquae Sextii, modern-day Aix-en-Provence in France. There, he built a large base cluster and began forming and training an army. His forces were substantial, consisting of something like 70 to 75,000 legionnaires and sundry other troop types. In 102 BC, the Germanic tribes who had somehow wrangled in additional Celtic allies elected to move on Italy. They began marching from Hispania and Gaul with the aim of converging on the Roman heartland. Marius moved west to intercept one of the groups in Gaul, while his fellow consul, with about half of the newly raised forces, established blocking positions in the Italian Alps to protect Rome directly. The opposing forces eventually found each other. While holed up in his camp, Marius was set upon by two Germanic tribes, the Teutones and the Ambrones. The camp held, and not possessing siege equipment, the Germanic warriors moved on. Undeterred and merely biding his time, Marius began tracking the tribes from a safe distance, looking for the proper spot and opportunity to attack them. Marius, great military architect that he may have been, saw his hand forced by chance, however. Small units from either side ended up in a skirmish near Aquae Sextii. This spiraled into a general action where Marius was able to best a force of up to 30,000 Ambrones. Nevertheless, it was the Germans' turn to now be undeterred. Several days later, knowing the Romans were not far behind, they formed up on the open ground around Aquae Sextii. Marius moved to meet them and took his time scouting the area, making sure he took every advantage from the terrain. With great wisdom, he procured a spot of high ground overlooking the plain and formed up his legions. Marius skillfully selected this spot because it gave his men all the advantages. The Germans had to move on him while tiring themselves as they slogged uphill. They then had to actually prosecute their attack moving up the ever-rising ground, never a nice proposition. Finally, the thronging tribesmen had to sustain the attack, looking up at their foes from the lower ground. Also, Marius had used camp personnel on a ruse to make his forces appear larger than they were. Lastly, and unbeknownst to the Germans, Marius had secreted several thousand men in a wood nearby that, on trigger, would attack the tribes in the rear or flank. In sum, the battle was not a walkover, but the Romans eventually prevailed. They reduced the Germans with their positioning and missile weapons in the early part of the battle. The legionnaires' perfection of close order battle allowed them to maintain cohesion, present a closed armored front, and rotate in fresh troops over and over during the middle stage of the combat. In the final phase, the troops in the wood eventually made their attack into the German rear, and this was too much. Their morale collapsed, and they were slaughtered. In Rome, the news of a Roman army actually beating the seething barbarian hordes seemed to unleash a sort of collective catharsis. One gets the sense that the Germanic tribes were now the new boogeyman following the vanquishing of Hannibal back in 202 BC. Nevertheless, the Cimbri were still intact, and Rome was not safe just yet. Luckily, Marius was up to the task. He brought them to battle in northern Italy at the Battle of the Rhodine Plain. Here, he again used his exceptional generalship to give his men every possible advantage. He positioned new troops with veteran troops on their flanks to bolster them. Next, he put the sun and wind to his back as well. This meant the enemy would be staring into bright sunlight, and that the dust from thousands of stomping feet and hooves would eventually envelop his opponent. Lastly, he dispersed his excellent subordinate commanders to key spots, thereby ensuring proper command and control. In the end, the Romans won another decisive victory, and now the threat from Germanic tribes was reduced to virtually nil for the foreseeable future. These two back-to-back victories were of epic strategic importance as they removed external existential threats. Now, only Rome could threaten Rome. And that is exactly what happened in the Social War. Marius did see action in the Social War against his one-time subordinate Sulla, but we have quite a clear picture of his high-order abilities by now. So, instead of diving into the Social War, let's address a topic of equal or possibly greater prominence for our video today. The so-called Marian reforms are quite well known and have been taken for granted as a historical fact. If that were the case, it would positively influence our rating of Marius. However, these reforms have been under heavy scrutiny as of late. The supposed changes enacted by Marius that allegedly created a professional army of non-landowners and also introduced new equipment, formations, and tactics among other innovations is now highly suspect. Dr. and Professor Brett Devereaux makes a nearly unassailable case that the Marian reforms, quote, weren't a thing, unquote. After reviewing research on his blog page entitled, A Collection of Unmitigated Pedantry, we're in his camp. The so-called Marian reforms are essentially a gross misreading and overly indulgent interpretation of ancient sources according to Devereaux. As such, we're taking them off the docket. Let us now move on to our scoring of Marius' generalship. Marius brought great victories to Rome. His efforts in the Jugurthine War and campaigns against Germanic tribes helped shore up Rome's southern flank and fully seal off, for a time at least, the northern flank. Marius absolutely rates a 3 here. Marius was fully expert at seizing opportunities. We see this clearly in his wars against the Teutones, Ambrones, and Cimbri. He was too calculating and sang-froid to be goaded into battles that did not favor him. Here too, we award him 3 points. Marius was equally adept at anticipation. He planned in detail, built his strength over time, and made wise decisions like blocking the northern Italian passes to prevent incursion by Germanic tribes. He wisely anticipated the bloodlust and bias towards headlong rushes and impetuosity of these tribes and created scenarios where they attacked him from positions of great disadvantage. Lastly, he had an intuition about individual men and anticipated their motives. We saw him play on and anticipate Bocchus' ambition and greed for Jugurtha's lands, which resulted in a conclusion to the Jugurthine War. Clearly, here again, he's worthy of 3 points. Marius was highly adaptive. He fought in many theaters against a variety of foes, to include fellow Romans possessed of great skill and resource. While he did not unleash many of the reforms he is credited with, he certainly adapted pre-existing tactics and social initiatives to his benefit. He simply could not have remained in the field for so many decades had he not been capable of mental, organizational, and doctrinal adaptations. 3 points again. Marius was a highly inspirational leader. The contempt and envy with which his political foes held him was met in opposite measure by his soldiers. Marius was a novus homo, or a new/self-made man. He was literally of the people, honored them as much as he disdained the social elites. His attack through enemy lines in the Jugurthine War at Muddle is legend and emblematic of his leadership. A score of 3 points here is a no-brainer. Marius never suffered a Cannae or Trebius-style defeat. Nevertheless, he did not have a record of unblemished victory. The war in North Africa dragged on long beyond his prediction, for example. He was surprised and beaten on more than one occasion, as many generals are. The German tribes fought him to stalemates at times, and he was usually severely outnumbered. Through it all, he appears consistently undaunted, however. He was gifted with unquenchable reserves of resilience, so we must go with 3 points here. In closing, however, we ironically give 2 points for lasting impact on the army. Given the new light in which we can view the so-called Marian reforms, his impact seems to be more on the Roman Republic generally than the army specifically. We mustn't forget his 7 consulships. His impact was neither wholly good nor wholly bad, but neutral. 2 points. In the end then, Marius ends up with a score of 19 out of 21, tying with Caesar. To review then, in our series so far, we have Germanicus now in 4th place, Trajan in 3rd, and Caesar and Marius tied for 2nd place. Only one more to go. Who do you think it will be? That's it for now. Thanks for tuning in yet again. We hope you are enjoying this series and will stick around to find out who's in 1st place. That video will be arriving very shortly. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed our content today. Drop us a line with ideas for videos or feedback on the ones already out. We try to answer all comments within 48 hours or less. Take care for now, and remember, knowledge is its own reward.